I am honored to be here today with you for this important inaugural event. I commend the organizers for this initiative, which provides a rare and important opportunity. In the next 20 minutes, I will tentare to provide you with a snapshot of the main elements of ocean governance. While I promise you that I will not dive too deeply into the technical and the legal, I will provide you with some practical considerations so as to assist you in contextualizing and grounding your discussions over the next 2 days and as you build out the One Ocean initiative. Allow me to begin by using the remote control. Allow me to begin by asking you to close your eyes for a minute. Take 2 breaths, deep breaths. I'm sure you know that the oxygen in every other breath you take comes from the ocean. Now picture a place, an oceanic place of work, of leisure, perhaps the view from your residence. What do you see? I see Tavolara, Calagirgolu. Some of you may be familiar with this area. But does it all look like this? Does it all look so peaceful and perfect? Unfortunately, it is not always the case. Our use of ocean spaces and resources, as well as our activities, are increasingly complex and interrelated. For example, we're increasingly seeing various forms of migration by sea. Piracy and armed robbery, while maybe under control in certain parts of the world, are increasing exponentially in others, as transnational criminal organizations vie to hold on to this lucrative trade route. We're also experiencing extraction of new mineral resources, including in the deep sea, places we've never gone to before and have very little understanding of. This trend is not positive. As the diversity and volume of activities and uses of resources are growing, their impacts are also increasing. And perhaps the most important thing of all is the cumulative impacts are starting to get ahead of nature and of our ability to control them. This is the principal finding of the World Ocean Assessment, which Vladimir mentioned earlier. This condition should be alarming to us all. Clearly, our individual and collective actions are not adding up to enough. And I would imagine that the recognition of this is why you are all here today. We need to better understand the system and nature, identify where and how we can make a real impact, and build better responses based on a common vision. Here comes the question. Who manages the ocean? And it is a good starting point for us to ask. The reply is that there is a wide range of actors and various frameworks. These can include states, intergovernmental organizations, that's the pretty collage of logos, civil society organizations in the private sector, many of you are probably part of this, and all of us, the individual. Now, if we look at the global level for a minute, there are many ways to map the complex system. However, the most important thing to note is the diversity in number of actors, even in this simplified representation. And this is, believe it or not, a very simple chart. The system is a mix of multiple political, diplomatic, legal, and institutional frameworks, each with their wide range of stakeholders operating on multiple geographical scales. For example, some that may be familiar to you. We have the Food and Agriculture Organization, FAO, based in Rome. One of its principal mandates is addressing issues of fisheries. We have the International Maritime Organization, IMO. Its principal mandate is shipping, and it has been around for a very long time. Of course, Vladimir talked about the IOC of UNESCO, one of the fundamental organizations of this system that fosters better science and builds the science policy interface. The GA, the General Assembly, top right with the blue circle. This is the Great Hall of Humanity. This is where we are all represented. We could unpack this diagram for days, but really I don't think it's necessary. You get the picture. It is complicated, but similar to nature's chaos, if you know where to look, you will find order. And order is good. Humanity generally seeks order to establish clarity, stability, and to evolve. Humanity seeks order through agreed upon norms usually, including legal frameworks. That's why you all have the lawyers. In the ocean, these are essential conditions to avoid conflicts. It's a good thing. To protect the freedom of navigation, one of our primary considerations since time immemorial. To regulate resources, to balance interests, particularly geostrategic interests, to accommodate new activities as we're constantly evolving, to protect and preserve the marine environment, something we're not doing well, and to foster and protect new investments. You can think about the blue economy and everything necessary to backstop this. Luckily, we have such a framework for the ocean, a constitution for the ocean. Again, Vladimir mentioned this briefly. This constitution comes in the form of the United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea. It is formulated with the vision that all problems of ocean space are closely interrelated and must be considered as a whole. This is very important. In other words, we must deal with ocean issues in a cohesive and holistic manner. It established for the first time a single set of basic rules for the ocean and represents an unprecedented attempt by the international community in its history to define maritime zones and regulate all aspects of the uses and resources of the ocean. It's a tremendous feat. It embodies in one framework all the traditional norms from time immemorial, and at the same time introduces the new legal concepts of the time. Now, I know the next slide is a little horrible to read, but bear with me. This is about as technical as I'm going to get. And trust me, it is much simpler than the text which emerged out of over a decade of negotiations and gave us this convention. The most important point to take away is that this is a comprehensive framework which dictates how we interact with ocean space, resources, and activities. It provides us with a definition of the maritime zones and the rights and responsibilities of the states within, including economic jurisdiction and the legal status of resources. I'll come back to this in a second because it is tremendously important. Of course, it provides for the protection of the marine environment and marine research, a fundamental component that we heard about this morning from Vladimir. But having listened to what I just explained, you may be wondering who owns what in the ocean? That's a pretty important question to have answered. Here again, I'm going to go to a diagram instead of 1,000 words on a slide, and I hope it'll help clarify that through the establishment of the zones of jurisdiction, the Convention balances the rights and interests of the coastal state on one side, protection, control of resources, with the rights and interests of maritime states on the other side. They're interested in the freedoms of navigation and accessing those resources. In short, the Convention has established who owns what and where, and importantly, how all should interact. Briefly, if you look at this diagram, you will see the land is represented by, of course, the cannon and the flag. This is the traditional notion of sovereignty. And in oceans, we tend to have an approach of looking at things from the land out, which is quite unfortunate. It would provide us with a new way of looking at things if we had the courage. You will understand, you probably know, that the territorial sea, the first 12 miles, the very famous 12 nautical mile territorial sea, states are more or less sovereign. They own it. You may pass with a ship if you're not threatening the state, but more or less it belongs to the state. State exercises jurisdiction beyond 12 nautical miles to the 24 nautical miles with issues of fiscal and sanitary measures. This is a leftover from the times of quarantines, the yellow flag and the ships far away from land. As we move out, the state must share more. By state, I mean obviously the coastal state. It has jurisdiction over the living marine resources. And then when we get past the 200 nautical miles, it's the commons. The international community has agreed through various mechanisms to manage things such as fisheries. And now, as Vladimir mentioned also, the states are looking at a new legal regime for areas beyond national jurisdiction that will regulate biodiversity. In fact, next week they'll be taking a major decision on whether or not to launch a diplomatic conference on this. On the bottom, the state remains sovereign for resources that are mineral and sedentary. And the scientists will laugh. Is a lobster sedentary? Very important question, for example, in Canada, because Canada owns the lobsters, right? Oil and gas, of course, mineral resources. And in the area beyond the continental shelf of the states, the global commons is managed by the International Seabed Authority. Having gone over this briefly, you'll understand that it's the fundamental basis for all ocean affairs and how we approach governance in the oceans. This is the simplest, most important thing to understand if you want to understand how oceans are managed. Now, let's talk a little bit about how states manage the oceans. We've clarified the ownership. Let us turn briefly to how it's managed. States develop a multitude of national approaches to governing oceans, spaces, resources, and activities. There is no right way. Some states seek to rationalize the pre-existing. This is the business as usual model, if you will. Other states create new systems. Some adopt sectoral approaches. Others seek integration across existing sectors. Again, the theme of chaos emerges, and the panorama is truly complex in some cases. Very simply, if you look at this slide, you imagine the amount of ocean-relevant laws that a state could have, found within environment, found within natural resources, found within the marine science, found within transport, within trade, labor. Sometimes these are coordinated, sometimes not. We put ocean policy in the middle here because many states are going towards that, trying to understand how to bring all of this together to be more effective. The same approaches and corresponding complexities are mirrored within institutional structures. These are numerous and diverse and have many stakeholders, sometimes centrally coordinated, and again, sometimes not. You can simply imagine, would the Ministry of Defense want to cooperate with the Ministry of Environment? Does the Ministry of Fisheries have enough boats that can go far enough to manage resources? Or do they need to rely on their colleagues from the Ministry of Defense? One can easily imagine the capacity burden this places on states, particularly developing states, least developing states, and small island developing states. Can we truly expect effective governance with these models? Interestingly, states are working also increasingly at the regional level, in part to try and do more with less, but also because regional scales are more manageable for cooperation, development, and the implementation of frameworks. They support commonalities of interest over conflict. And interestingly, the political and ecological systems coincide better. Now, with the who and the how mapped out, we can now turn for a moment to making a bigger impact. And I think this is what this forum is really about. Looking forward, as you consider where and how you can engage, including from this forum, I propose that it is critical for you to truly understand the system you're trying to impact. Don't take the word of anybody. The interests are too large and too diverse. Find your place. Implement already what we have. We have so much that isn't being used that is so positive. I would also say that you need to ensure that there is a common vision, that you consider all interests and agree to a common way forward. Vladimir mentioned the SDGs earlier, the Sustainable Development Goals. This is potentially one of those mechanisms that can do this for us. Also managing conflicts upstream and understanding why we fail to when we fail. Inclusive approaches are critical. Identifying stakeholders, ensuring that the stakeholders are meaningfully involved, and making sure that they all are working towards the same goal. All too often we fail because of these simple principles are not respected or understood. And, very much like business, we need to be reactive, predictive. We need to have constant monitoring and evaluation, true monitoring and evaluation, meaningfully, that is based on ecosystem considerations, and be really adaptive. Now, if all I have presented seems complicated, it should not stop us. I propose that we can start taking immediate action which will yield important impacts. Immediate action must start with known critical enablers, those which can be leveraged across the systems at all levels and fundamentally change the way we coexist with the ocean. This can be achieved, I think, properly by building human capital and addressing the lack of financing for ocean affairs. Simply, on the human capital side, we need to recenter the individual in the formula. Human capital leads to institutional capital, not the other way around. And we need to engage the right people with the right kind of skills and make sure they're meaningfully included in the formulas. Youth and women as a major stakeholder group are fundamental. We need to start understanding they are not a victim, but they're part of a solution. They bring to the table innovation. On the ocean financing side, we need a common donor vision. Things are so fragmented, the panorama is incredibly complex. We need to mobilize funds through new pathways and invest in new models, such as private partnerships and social impact investment. All this is possible, and it's all right in front of us. Now, before the coffee break, I'd like to finally end with a math problem. Does 1 plus 1 equal 1.1? No? Sure? 1 and then a 1 and then you have a 1 and a 1. No. Okay. By this I mean the individual initiatives, the ones that we're all taking, are not impactful enough to make a change at a global scale that is necessary. While each of those initiatives has value in itself, potentially, we're not leveraging all of these initiatives to move forward. This is the point. It does equal 1.1 today. The challenge for our collective action is to have 1 plus 1 equal 2. And as I mentioned earlier, perhaps the Sustainable Development Goals will allow us to rationalize this calculus, allow us to eliminate the strategic bottlenecks to existing implementation, allow us to build capital, which I mentioned, human and financial, allow us to establish new modes of cooperation. However, I would go one step further. Forgive me. I would say, given the state of the oceans today, we can't stop there. We need 1 + 1 to equal 11. This is your challenge, and this is the challenge I pose to the One Ocean Forum. I thank you for the opportunity to contribute, and rest assured that the Division for Ocean Affairs and Law of the Sea is happy to accompany you along your journeys as you move forward. Thank you very much.